Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in. So there is actually an exhibition that is married to another exhibition titled African Roots. That is African Routes, and it speaks to the ways in which those Africans, as was just noted, who were brought primarily from the West and West Central African regions of the continent, would come to birth the African diaspora as we know it. Of course, voluntary and involuntary movement of African people existed before the transatlantic slave trade, but the way that we understand the African diaspora, particularly within the context of the Western Hemisphere, comes as a result of the ingenuity of these people who are being placed against their will, and yet finding a way to forge quite voluntarily through the agency of their humanity. And this is just a little bit about how those communities forge their way in their path, and in doing so impact the Lowcountry. So don't mind me looking down. It is a phone. I promise I'm not checking texts. It's so that I can keep time, because I'm in the business of museums and they don't hire us to be succinct. Okay, we're gonna try it one more time. Hey, there we go. So Charlestown in Barbados. We often describe at the museum, and I like to think about Charleston, quite frankly, especially considering that for many decades after its founding, it's thought about as an extension of the Barbadian colony, as an African diasporic space from its very origins. So often when we think about the early settlers, the majority of whom very quickly become Barbadian English planters, we don't think about they're enslaved. But in fact, when they come, they are also bringing enslaved Africans with them, who have begun to establish norms and ways of being and living and cultures within the enslaved communities that exist in Barbados. And they're bringing those traditions, those ideas, and those ideals alongside them and within them. So we can see this noted in architecture and design, which I know has been a real feature of your experience here in Charleston, and for good reasons. So when we think about the single house style, the coloration of Charleston, I mean, Savannah and Charleston aren't too far apart in terms of time, with regard to founding, but when we look at Old Charleston, if you've ever been to the Anglophone Caribbean, it really, really speaks. And I remember the first time I visited Charleston, having lived in the Bahamas first, I thought to myself, because I knew some things about Charleston, but I didn't know all the things about Charleston. I've come to learn so much since making my way in my home here in the Lowcountry, but it was so eerily familiar. The pinks, the pastels, the inclining towards wood, the piazzas, the gardens. These are all very much reflections of that Anglophone Caribbean architectural and decorative style and approach, something that I became very familiar with living in the Bahamas. And it isn't a mistake that the Bahamas look so much like Charleston since post the American Revolution. Many of those loyalists who lived right here in the Carolinas were offered land grants, massive land grants in the Bahamas to permanently settle it. And as a matter of fact, the largest migration of peoples of African descent to the Bahamas would happen in that time. What I also want to note, however, beyond Speightstown being a twin to Old Charleston, which is one of the towns, the first town from which those Barbadian English settlers make their way to what becomes Charlestown, is that what's often overlooked is how common it is for enslaved labor to be utilized in the building and construction. There's an early note from Sarah with regard to the history and the legacy of iron workers, and even other skilled laborers like carpenters. And I'm going to note agricultural technology, which I'll get into a bit more later, but that these were features of African societies that these same enslaved Africans had been brought from. Brick making was often the work of enslaved children. So one of those more intimate notes that you might make as you're moving more closely through Old Charleston are the fingerprints that they leave behind in the bricks that they would have constructed. In fact, it isn't uncommon when renovating a home on the peninsula to find old slave badges. Slave badges, is everyone familiar with the slave badge system? If you are, I won't mention it. I see nodding, so I'll continue forward. But this is also a note to those so-called skilled laborers who happened to be enslaved. And there were many, many, many jobs that they were doing. And the purpose of the slave badge, for anyone that isn't familiar, was to, one, offer their enslaver the opportunity to increase profit from that skilled labor. However, it was also used as a means to identify an enslaved person and their permissions by their enslaver to move about the city of Charleston. It was also a license. Some believe it was the earliest licensing system in the colonial Americas, but it was without question one of the earliest. And you paid the city treasury in order to provide or to be provided this license. And then we have the plantation system, which is something that folks might not always think about. However, the ways in which enslavement is practiced throughout the Western Hemisphere varies relatively widely depending on the empire or cultural association. And also why you're in the space that you're in. The United States is pretty unique in that it becomes the home of enslavers, whereas virtually everywhere else it is a colony. It is not the country, it is not the motherland, it is not the homeland, adopted or otherwise. And those Barbadian English settlers are bringing a Caribbean plantation system. There are two features of that plantation system. One is in the Caribbean, planters tended to be, although not always, affluent. Well, one, being in the business of enslavement was expensive. So it was a rich man's game, generally speaking. However, these were plantations that were pretty vast estates. So it required a level generally of affluence, and in many instances, they were lower ranking nobles. This also meant that not always, but in many instances, those individuals were part-time residents and only partial managers of their properties. Because they were so vast, they required significant numbers of enslaved people. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that distance of enslaver to enslaved matters when it comes to cultural retention a little bit further in my presentation. But one note is it ensured that for those wealthier enslavers who would be living here permanently but still practicing that Caribbean system, that their homes would be constructed further afield. So that plantation system is also giving birth to the peninsula homes, those single houses that we see, however, far more opulent than the vernacular architecture of what we might think about more akin to a shotgun house, because they don't live on the plantations themselves. What this also does, though, because of these large plantations and the system itself that requires these large numbers of enslaved Africans to work them, is that Charleston, by the numbers, although not with respect to power, is a majority black colony by the early 18th century. Although these enslaved Africans who are making their way from Barbados are some of the first to arrive, we note quite frequent, we underscore, I'll say, at I am, and that's how we refer to the International African American Museum, and I highly encourage you to do the same. We emphasize that the arrival of enslaved Africans to the Western Hemisphere and North America, quite frankly, does not begin with 1619. As early as the very early 16th century, you have black conquistadors arriving as enslaved as well as free people. However, and I just note that, one, from a timing perspective, but also because those Barbadian enslaved are not the only Africans that are being brought. As was earlier noted, our property operates on what was Gadsden's Wharf. Charleston is responsible for an estimated 40% of the importation of captive Africans that will make their way into what becomes the United States of America through the transatlantic slave trade. And rice, which is the first king, not cotton, which I know everybody in here already knows, which ultimately makes Charleston the first center of uber wealth in a colonial America, is a failed effort in its first attempts. And one of the really interesting components and elements of history is that when we begin to uncover, whether literally or figuratively, it helps us understand and contextualize things that we maybe had thought about differently before. And so one of those discoveries, if you will, when it comes to rice, is that the transatlantic slave trade in and of itself was a much more strategic operation. Because when the rice economy or the efforts to cultivate rice fail, there's a determination to seek after and to capture Africans who have rice cultivating skill sets and technologies that have already evolved. Rice, its earliest cultivation on the African continent actually occurs more than 3,000 years ago in West Africa and the Niger Delta. Now some say Niger. So it is Africans who are being brought from the Senegambian region as well as the Windward Coast. We note that the price at auction for so-called rice Negroes is often significantly higher, and it is also successful. The proof is, as they say, in the pudding, because the tidal rice process that those Africans are bringing with them is expanded, brought to economic scale here in the Lowcountry. But what's more is not just the transfer of knowledge, which is why I say brilliance, not just skills, is that they have to transform hard-bottom cypress swamp into arable rice plantations. So they're not just cultivating rice, they're actually building, engineering the dikes and dam system. They're bringing all of that, and they're doing it, particularly for those first generations, under some of the most heinous conditions one can possibly imagine. I actually, as much as I talk about it, still find it very difficult to imagine, because rice cultivation is only second to sugarcane plantations in dangerousness and mortality. One might imagine working, we think about a Hilton Head and the Sea Islands now as these very picturesque spaces, but as we're driving by them, we might note and perhaps speed past those marsh spaces with those lovely signs that remind us of our neighbors like alligators and venomous snakes who are native to the region. But it's mosquitoes, those smaller fauna that were much more dangerous, as well as the microbes that would create all kinds of issues and challenges for those enslaved who were working in those completely undeveloped marsh spaces. They had to use and transform those skills, do it underneath those kinds of conditions for those first arriving without the value of speaking English. So being provided instruction without having the benefit of knowing the language of your captor, and in many instances not knowing the language of your neighbor, because they weren't always coming from the exact same regions, although they had a similar body of skill sets. One note, and this is something that I find especially harrowing as a mother, and sort of speaks to the grandiosity of what it is to be a human being under such insufferable circumstances, is that the gift of modern technology has allowed us to uncover what many enslaved burial grounds have to tell us about the danger of the rice plantation economy. And that is that in many instances, the majority of the burial grounds are built and constructed to a child's size, which meant that for those parents who were laboring and engaging in this work, when they lost their children, they still had to go and work. I, like you, who find yourselves holding breath, never cease to be overwhelmed at what it must have meant to have to continue to work. And that work would not only build this incredibly vibrant economy, and not just rice plantation, but also Sea Island cotton later on, as well as indigo. But this would be a body of wealth from which those folks would never benefit. Foodways. Well, while they were also building this economy, they were cooking that rice. And red rice and if you haven't had red rice, you must have properly done red rice, is the granddaughter of jollof, which is a Senegambian traditional rice that utilizes tomato, okra, and pepper. Would often, as was very common because these were seafaring communities, use seafood as a way of seasoning. The common pot approach to cooking, which we see is very common throughout the South, and varies depending on where you are. So in Louisiana, particularly New Orleans, and you're having a gumbo, you better start that with a roux. But that's a combining of African and French cooking techniques. Here, where we have okra stew, there is a different approach where okra is actually being used directly as the thickener. So you have not just the transformation, but also this combining of cultures to bring forth a new tradition and a new idea. And I note foodways because sometimes those seeds are being carried in the braids of African captives' hair. However, what's so incredible is that we have the opportunity now to enjoy this fare, sometimes in the finest of restaurants on this very same peninsula, often not realizing from whence it comes. And this brings me to the Gullah Geechee. So remember when I noted that Caribbean plantation system that seemed to relegate enslaved Africans to their homes, where, generally speaking, their enslaver lived further afield? Well, this separation also offered a kind of cover for those enslaved, both organically but also strategically, to find ways to retain their traditional values, practices, and identities, to live an authentic life, or a more authentic life, separate from their labor, which we often don't think about as much. What would it have been like for an enslaved person to live? Well, enslaved people knew they were people. They just weren't codified as such. So Africans who labored by day were able to engage in community building and cultural preservation practices within these enslaved communities. Language retention, there are literally dozens of Fula terms and phrases that you can find in the Gullah Geechee language. But you see this less in other parts of the South, but very, very present in parts of the Caribbean and South America, where you might find that syncopated, rapid-fire Spanish Caribbean, or I should say, Spanish Caribbean Spanish or Castellano spoken in maybe a Dominican Republic, the vernacular English of Jamaica, or the Creole that's spoken in Haiti. Religious practice, the ring shout. Approximately 1 in 3 of all Africans that are being brought, particularly to the Lowcountry, are actually practitioners of Islam, which is a very common religious practice, particularly within the Senegambian region, which is where many of those rice-cultivating Africans were being brought from. And the ring shout was actually, although it was being practiced within a church communal context, a remaking or a reimagining of the movement around the Kaaba, which is an act or a ritual that occurs as part of one of Muslims' most holy, as a matter of fact, it's a pillar of the religion, which is to make Hajj, and this is one of the rituals that they engage when making Hajj in Mecca, which is to circle the Kaaba, this holy black stone. The syncopation of hand rhythm. I will say, the Black Codes of 1741 that make drums illegal necessitate, as a result of the Stoner Rebellion, necessitate the use of the hand. And so in the Gullah community, you'll hear it known as the Gullah clap. Throughout much of many African-American communities where Gullah Geechee would continue to move as a result of the Great Migration as well as other movements, we call it a soul clap or a church clap. But you see this continuation because the syncopation of rhythm is incredibly common within the drum structure of West Africa, as well as this call and response, a kind of singing of anthem and note, a way in which one confirms and affirms. It's very common. There is no fourth wall. The entertainer is the entertained, and vice versa. I'm almost done, I promise. And then there's communal ritual. that we see reflected in the practice of seeking, which is an actual rites of passage that continues to occur in the Gullah Geechee community. And as most rites of passages, it is a secret and sacred practice. But what we do know is that historically, children who were in their early teens would be sent out into the forest to have revelation. They would be sent on their own. Sometimes they would take a bit of memorabilia or ephemera from their family, in many instances a slave badge itself, and would bury it. And once they'd had that sort of spiritual revelation, they would return to the community to become full members and citizens within it, as well as fully fledged members of their church. But we understand this to be absolutely an extension of rites of passage processes, rituals that occurred almost unanimously or ubiquitously across the western and west central regions of the African continent. And then finally, sweetgrass. Now, in the modern era, we often see sweetgrass expressed in Mount Pleasant, if you're heading down 17, or in the city market as fare for tourist consumption. But the history of sweetgrass, much like the Gullah, is as complex as the weaving process and the patterns of the baskets themselves. It is also an inheritance of those West Africans captured and brought to the Lowcountry to build the rice economy. And these baskets, however ornamental in the present, were once much more utilitarian, as they were used to fan rice in the processing component of rice, of the rice plantation system. Traditionally done by men, as many master artisans in West Africa would have been men. It became a tradition taken up by women, often older, and is now ubiquitously sort of kind of thought about with elder femme black members of the community. Although we do see some young men who have begun to take up the tradition. But within the Gullah, it became very much something centered around the women of the community and would often be passed down from mother to daughter. What is incredible about sweetgrass is that, as ornate as it is, like the Gullah culture and community, it continues to evolve and thrive. And so we see this represented, and it's very much through the ingenuity and the agency and the creativity of the people themselves. So I'm like wearing sweetgrass earrings today. I almost purchased a pair of sweetgrass sandals. But there are ways in which the designs are being thought about and are being rethought. And then, of course, you have this ornate basket that's represented here, but you see sweetgrass sort of living not just as an artisanal practice, but really as a fine art in the modern age, as well as one that's begun to build a cottage economy for members of the Gullah Geechee community to be able to benefit in ways that their skill sets and their sweetgrass would not have historically. Thank you.